Welcome back. I'm Larry C. Johnson. In a world of constant change and information overload, understanding the facts is key to making good decisions. Today, we're not just going to skim through the facts, we're going to stop, dissect, and dive deep into the full-scale attack on Donald Trump, the warning from Russia, and the stern warnings directed at the United States and Ukraine. From dry data to hidden trends, I'll help you uncover the secrets behind the numbers and the stories. I look at the war in Ukraine and the wider global crisis as one single connected story. The slow collapse of the old Western imperial system and the emergence of a new security architecture in which Russia is at the center. Everything else, the media narratives, the propaganda, the emotional manipulation is layered on top of that basic reality. Vladimir Putin has been completely clear. Russia will halt its military operations in Ukraine when the Ukrainian armed forces withdraw from the territories that Russia now controls. If they do not withdraw voluntarily, Russia will achieve that objective by military means. The amount of territory coming under Russian control keeps increasing, the tempo of Russian advances is accelerating, and on every front the operational dynamic is positive for Russia. Russian forces are systematically destroying Ukrainian military infrastructure. The remnants of Kyiv's Nazi-style formations and NATO's proxy capabilities, not bombing children as Western media like to pretend. Even the recent wave of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian civilian infrastructure has been shamelessly inverted in Western coverage. Footage of Ukrainian strikes on civilian buildings in places like Krasnodar has been repackaged and presented as alleged Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities. This is not an isolated incident. It is the pattern from day one of this conflict. From the very start, this war has been built on a foundation of fake news and information warfare, conducted by NATO, by the Kyiv regime, and by Western political and media elites. The goal has always been to demonize Russia, to delegitimize any Russian security concerns, and to manipulate Western public opinion into supporting an open-ended proxy war. Russians have endured a relentless campaign of vilification in international media, an attempt to erase them from global sport and culture, and a comprehensive sanctions regime that tries to isolate them economically and diplomatically. Their athletes are banned, their airlines are restricted, their financial institutions are attacked, and their people are treated as pariahs in Europe and North America. That is part of the war. It is not just tanks and artillery. It is a psychological war against the Russian people. If you consume Western mass media on Ukraine, I can tell you with confidence that 99% of what you see is either a lie, a half-truth, or a carefully curated omission. They lie about Russian strikes, they lie about Ukrainian strikes, they lie about the opinion of the Russian public, and they lie about the real balance of forces on the battlefield. At this punto, these outlets have exhausted all benefit of the doubt. They had countless chances to tell the truth and chose instead to construct a narrative designed to serve the interests of NATO and the Western political class. They are not interested in informing citizens. They are paid to manufacture consent, to support war, and to disguise strategic failures. That is why the only rational attitude toward the big Western networks and newspapers when they talk about Russia and Ukraine is total skepticism. Whatever they say, you assume the opposite, then you check facts independently and draw your own conclusions. The same machinery of deception is applied to every target the empire selects. Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela, any state that refuses to submit. Western outlets benefit from an undeserved aura of authority simply because they appear on television screens or carry famous mastheads, but their business model is narrative engineering. There may be a few individual journalists with some shred of professional conscience, but they are marginalized or fired the moment they seriously challenge the dominant line. The system rewards compliant propagandists, not truth-tellers. When you see these people screaming about Russia preparing to invade Europe, you are not hearing an honest security assessment. You are listening to salespeople for the military-industrial complex and politicians trying to boost their ratings at home by inventing an external threat On the ground in Ukraine, the reality could not be further from the heroic fantasy pushed by Western media. Desertion rates in the Ukrainian army are catastrophic. Even Western outlets have been forced to acknowledge the crisis. Kiev is reduced to grabbing men off the streets, beating them into submission, and throwing them into the front lines with minimal training and equipment. Many look like wanderers, exhausted, half-starved, visibly abandoned by the very authorities who claim to be defending democracy. Russia, by contrast, is recruiting largely on a voluntary, contractual basis, paying its soldiers well from Russian state resources. Russian units are stable, motivated, and properly supplied, while Ukraine is bleeding out its manpower in a war it cannot win. If Ukrainian troops chose to surrender, Russia would be prepared to accept that and end this slaughter. If they continue to obey a suicidal regime in Kyiv and the NATO planners behind it, the attrition will simply continue until Ukraine as a state is hollowed out. There will be no genuine popular uprising in Ukraine against this regime as long as the money from Washington and Brussels keeps flowing. Western intelligence agencies know perfectly well how to manufacture protest when they want them. We saw that in the Maidan coup, where cash, cookies, and coaching were poured into the streets to topple an elected government that stood in the way of NATO expansion and Western corporate interests. Those are the dangerous demonstrations, the ones sponsored by the CIA, MI6, and EU structures to enforce regime change. When protests threaten Western designs or question NATO policy, they are ignored, infiltrated, or crushed. Today, even the Western elites are deeply divided over what to do next in Ukraine. The original plan was simple: break Russia, trigger regime change in Moscow, seize control of its resources, and consolidate Western hegemony over Eurasia. That plan has failed. There is no plan B that makes strategic sense for Washington and its allies. They are stuck between escalating a conflict they are losing and retreating in a way that exposes their weakness. We see the same paralysis in other theaters, in Venezuela, in the broader Middle East, but Ukraine is the central front of this systemic crisis. Putin himself has commented on this strategic confusion. He noted that recent EU sanctions against major Russian energy companies such as Lukoil and Rosneft were a surprise, even for Moscow. Not because Russia is afraid of sanctions, but because these measures hurt the American people as well. Previous U.S. administrations hesitated to go that far, knowing that such sanctions would raise fuel prices and worsen inflation inside the United States. The current leadership in Washington is perfectly willing to sacrifice its own citizens' economic well-being in order to pursue a harder line against Russia. That should tell you something about their priorities. They talk endlessly about American workers and middle-class families, but when push comes to shove, they will cut those people's throats economically if it serves imperial objectives. When you look at how Russia dealt with Europe before this war, you see the contrast. Russia built pipelines, delivered cheap gas and oil, and offered Europe a long-term, mutually beneficial energy partnership. Europe, under pressure and its own imperial illusions, chose instead to sabotage that relationship and blow up its own economic future. They traded dependable Russian energy for expensive, unstable supplies and political dependency on Washington. They thought they were going to dismember Russia and plunder its resources. Instead, they have crippled their own industries, impoverished their populations, and discovered that Russia can reorient its exports to Asia and the global south. This is what strategic stupidity looks like. The same dynamic plays out in the Western approach to Venezuela, to Iran, to any country that tries to exercise sovereign control over its resources. For decades, the United States and its allies have used coups, assassinations, sanctions, and information warfare to try to bend those states to their will instead of negotiating straightforward energy and trade deals that could have benefited both sides. They could have had long-term contracts, predictable supplies, and stable partners. Instead, they chose extortion, theft, and constant interference, undermining trust completely. That is why more and more states are turning toward Russia, China, and emerging multilateral groupings. They see in Moscow and Beijing partners who negotiate, who keep their word, and who do not stage coups the minute a contract is signed. This is also why Putin's statements about peace negotiations in Ukraine matter. He has said clearly that Russia is ready to discuss the U.S. plan point by point, and that a U.S. delegation is expected in Moscow to work through the details. According to him, there is no real draft agreement yet, just a set of questions that must be translated into the language of formal diplomacy. Some parts of the U.S. proposal are frankly ridiculous. Others at least recognize that Russia's core security demands must be addressed. But while Russia signals readiness to negotiate seriously, key Western officials publicly declare that now is not the time for peace and insist that Ukraine must keep fighting even as its army collapses and its society is exhausted. They say openly that Kyiv should prolong the war because peace does not suit Western objectives at this moment. It is easy to call for endless war when it is not your sons being thrown into the meat grinder. Another crucial point Putin has emphasized is the illegitimacy of the current regime in Kyiv. By the terms of Ukraine's own constitution, Zelensky's presidential mandate expired in May 2024. No elections have been held. No serious effort has been made to renew popular consent. The government in Kyiv is now ruling without constitutional legitimacy, without a legal mandate from its own people, while dragging that same population into catastrophe at the behest of NATO. Western media never pose this basic question. They never say. Some jurists argue that Zelensky's rule is now unconstitutional. Others claim he is still legitimate because of wartime conditions. Let's lay out both positions. They simply hide the issue and pretend nothing has changed, because acknowledging it would undermine their narrative of Ukraine as a vibrant democracy resisting Russian aggression. Putin argues that Kyiv made a strategic mistake by refusing to hold elections and by rejecting earlier opportunities for a negotiated settlement. Russia, despite being in a state of armed conflict, held elections without difficulty. Ukraine chose to cling to power extra legally and double down on a war it cannot win. Within Ukraine, there are many people who want normal, long-term relations with Russia, who understand the deep historical and cultural ties between the two societies. Those people are silenced, persecuted, or driven abroad by NATO-backed institutions and media. Meanwhile, the West floods Ukraine and other targeted countries with money to buy elites, to corrupt political systems, and to create a comprador class willing to sacrifice their own populations for Western favor. For years, the United States and Europe could afford this strategy because they controlled the global financial system. They could print dollars and euros, use them to bribe politicians and NGOs across the world, and pass the costs on via inflation and debt. That era is ending with the rise of alternative payment systems, de-dollarization efforts, and new trade blocs. The West can no longer buy infinite loyalty. Its ability to corrupt and coerce is diminishing, and as that power wanes, its internal contradictions and failures become harder to hide. Against this backdrop, Russia's posture is remarkably straightforward. Putin has even joked that Russia can sign whatever piece of paper Western leaders want, affirming that it has no intention of attacking Europe because such an attack has never been on the agenda. From Moscow's perspective, the hysteria about a Russian invasion of Europe is absurd. Russia is defending itself against NATO encroachment, securing its own borders and people, and responding to a threat that the West itself created by trying to drag Ukraine into an alliance explicitly directed against Russia. If you leave Russia alone, it behaves like a hibernating bear focused on its own development, its own society. If you invade its space, threaten its security, and send weapons to its doorstep, you are the one waking the bear, and you should not be surprised by the consequences. What makes the current situation tragic is that Europe and Russia were natural partners. Their economies were complementary. Their cultures, despite differences, could have coexisted in a cooperative framework. Instead, driven by American hegemony and their own predatory instincts, Western elites chose confrontation, sanctions, and proxy war. They squandered an historic opportunity and may not get another. In the meantime, Russia is building an alternative network of relationships with China, with Iran, with countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, based on mutual respect and non-interference. These emerging structures, from BRICS to various regional initiatives, represent the embryo of a genuinely multipolar world order grounded in international law rather than Western fiat. The key point is this: Russia has been consistent about its aims. It wants a neutral Ukraine, no NATO on its borders, and a stable security order across Eurasia. It is ready to negotiate, but not to capitulate. Western leaders, by contrast, keep changing their story from Russia will be crushed by sanctions to Ukraine will win on the battlefield to we must prevent a wider war while escalating step by step and refusing to admit they miscalculated. The longer they cling to this fantasy, the more Ukrainians die, the more Europe collapses economically, and the more the United States erodes its own credibility. If there is a way out of this crisis, it lies in accepting reality. Russia is not going to be defeated. Its core security concerns must be addressed, and the West must learn to live in a world where it is no longer the sole arbiter of legitimacy and power. Until that happens, Russia will continue doing exactly what it is doing now, advancing on the ground in Ukraine, consolidating new alliances globally, and exposing, day after day, the lies and failures of the old imperial order. There has been a significant spike in controversy within the United States regarding a recent video message created by 6 Democratic members of Congress, both senators and representatives, directed specifically at the United States Armed Forces. The lawmakers stated unequivocally that military personnel have not only the right but the obligation to refuse unlawful orders. While this principle is absolutely true, their video never explained what unlawful orders they were referring to, nor what prompted such a declaration. The lack of clarity ignited a political firestorm. The White House, the Pentagon, prominent political figures, and the public quickly became polarized. Some individuals interpreted the message as a necessary warning that the administration is preparing to give unconstitutional commands. Others argued the opposite, that the lawmakers were behaving recklessly and undermining lawful civilian authority over the military. One Senator, Mark Kelly, has become the central figure of this controversy. Kelly is not only a legislator, but a retired Air Force officer and astronaut. Because he retired rather than separated normally, he remains subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The Pentagon has publicly stated that he could legally be recalled to active duty in order to be court-martialed for his actions. President Trump reacted by calling the lawmakers seditious and claimed before deleting the post that execution could be appropriate. The Pentagon issued statements asserting its authority to investigate and potentially prosecute. The tensions escalated to a disturbing level. The reality, however, is more complicated than choosing which side is correct. Neither the administration nor the lawmakers are acting responsibly. Their political conflict is now being projected onto the United States military, an institution that must remain apolitical to function. Soldiers are being placed in a crucible where obeying or disobeying orders could lead to legal jeopardy either way. This entire uproar is based on something the military already understands. From day one of service, personnel are trained rigorously in the law of armed conflict and the concept of lawful versus unlawful orders. The Nuremberg principles form the historical foundation. I was just following orders is no defense against war crimes. Every service member knows that a clearly illegal order must be refused. Simultaneously, they must obey all lawful orders. Failure to do so results in punishment under Article 92 of the UCMJ. So, why the video? What specific action is being warned against? No explanation was offered. As a result, each viewer is left to assume the worst. Are these lawmakers referring to deployment of troops into U.S. cities, a constitutionally sensitive issue? Or the administration's aggressive posture in the Caribbean toward Venezuela? The ambiguity is itself politically charged. Consider a hypothetical order to engage Venezuelan military forces without congressional authorization or international legal support. Some would argue such action is unlawful under both U.S. and international law. But if a service member refuses to carry out the order, the administration's lawyers can easily certify the action as legal, placing the individual at severe risk of prosecution and imprisonment. The same applies to lethal targeting of suspected drug operations at sea. The law remains contested, and the consequences for guessing wrong are life-changing. Asking troops to gamble with their liberty while politicians reap political benefits is deeply unethical. Caroline Levitt and others critical of the lawmakers have emphasized correctly that the military cannot function if each individual soldier decides for themselves whether an order is valid. Chaos would ensue. However, she overstated when she claimed all orders are presumed lawful and therefore must be obeyed without question. History, including incidents like the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, proves otherwise. Soldiers must assess an order if it appears unlawful and seek clarification. If an officer insists upon an explicitly illegal act, the duty to refuse becomes absolute. Both sides, therefore, oversimplify. The administration seems to desire unquestioned authority, implying that if the president issues an order, it is inherently legal. That stance is incompatible with constitutional oversight and dangerous in principle. Meanwhile, the legislators claim to be protecting the rule of law, yet refuse to specify the threat they are warning about, suggesting their messaging is driven in part by political maneuvering rather than genuine concern. The danger in all of this is the politicization of the armed forces. Service members come from the American population. They include liberals and conservatives, voters of every persuasion. Injecting partisan conflict into military obedience threatens to fracture unit cohesion, morale, and trust. Soldiers may begin questioning each other's motives, and loyalty to the mission may be evaluated based not on law but on ideology. This is a direct path to the breakdown of civil-military relations. If lawmakers believe unlawful orders are imminent, they have constitutional remedies: legislative action, judicial oversight, public hearings. Instead, they have chosen a messaging tactic that risks destabilizing the command structure and the administration. Rather than tolerating criticism, a hallmark of a constitutional government is responding with threats that stretch the boundaries of its authority.